Let me start off with one simple question. What do you see when you think of Paris, France? Chances are, when you're asked that question, you can see a very clear image of what you perceive Paris to be, much more than other cities around the world. Throughout history to modern day, the city has been a leader in pushing the capabilities and perceptions of what people believe an urban space to be capable of. An example of this is how, in preparation for the 2024 Summer Olympics, the city has been revitalizing its automobile-focused infrastructure and giving space back to pedestrians and cyclists in order to limit automobile traffic within the city in favor of a more sustainable and publicly accessible option. It's no wonder that the City of Light is held in such high regard by millions of individuals around the globe, and its impact on the culture that forms everything around us cannot be understated. However, with light, there's inevitable darkness, of which Paris knows very well. Over the last several years, the citizens of Paris have raised their voices and drawn attention to the inequity that is riddled throughout the city. Strikes spearheaded from workers from numerous sectors, transportation, sanitation, healthcare, and more have grown increasingly prominent in recent years as the everyday Parisian fights for the right to adequate compensation so that they can live comfortably within their own city. This, however, is nothing new for Paris, and in order to truly understand how deep the roots of this inequity goes, we must understand the story of the city and how it became what it is today. To do that, we have to back up just a little bit to when the city first began, almost 2 millennia ago. The first residents of Paris settled along what is now modern Ile de la Cité, home of numerous notable landmarks such as the Notre Dame Cathedral. These settlers were known as the Parisians and originally settled in the area due to its centrality throughout northern Europe, as well as the protection and natural boundaries that the island within the Seine River of which they settled on provided. They named the area Lutetia and resided in there until they were eventually overtaken by the Roman Empire in the late 50s BCE. When the Roman Empire took over Lutetia, they quickly began working towards expanding the city. They used the Seine River as a north arrow and expanded the city along its left bank. This is how Lutetia existed for centuries until the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century CE. The most notable civilizations which invaded the settlement during the time were the Anglo-Normans from England and the Frankish Empire from the east. Because of the unrest, the city, now known as Lutetia Parisi, remained in a pretty spatially stagnant place for centuries until the expansion of the right bank in 1215 CE by Philippe Auguste, self-proclaimed first king of France. Eventually, due to rising tensions, the Franks and the Anglo-Normans began what would become known as the 100 Years' War due to the English's claim to the French throne. It wasn't until, 120 years later when the war ended and the Frankish Empire defeated the Anglo-Normans in establishing the Kingdom of France, creating the political foundations which continues to guide the city today. As the city continued to expand, it also began to grow more cramped, particularly in areas of the city where citizens of lower socioeconomic classes lived. This proved to be a huge issue in the turn of the 15th century with the infamous bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, which killed up to 50 million Europeans. Being an airborne disease, the bubonic plague devastated the particularly cramped streets of Paris where the everyday Parisian lived. Because of the rapidly rising death rate and the increasingly limiting city boundaries, the cemeteries throughout Paris began to overflow to uncontrollable rates. Despite these limitations, Paris continued to steadily grow within the established walls. However, this expansion quickly halted when the city itself began to crumble beneath the immense pressure and fall into the abandoned limestone mines that were built beneath the city. In the 14th century, these mines were carved out underneath the ever-growing city. However, eventually the mines were thoroughly excavated and thus abandoned. They would remain untouched underneath the city for several hundred years, slowly deteriorating. As time passed and the mine's condition worsened, concerns grew over the structural integrity. This concern was realized when the city experienced numerous cave-ins, which devastated streets and posed a major risk for residents. It became clear that something needed to be done in order to preserve the structure of the city. Around the same time, King Louis XVI had begun focusing on reworking land usage within the city's boundaries. With a rapidly shrinking availability of land, Louis XVI decreed for inner-city cemeteries, the same ones which became the resting place for the millions of Parisians whose lives were lost due to Black Plague, to be demolished and the bodies buried within them to be moved into the limestone mines so that they could use the bones as a makeshift foundation which holds up the city. This same foundation is what continues to hold up the city to this very day. Because of the mass move, a lot of the bodies which previously had headstones to show who the deceased individual once was, no longer had that identifying feature with how quickly the bodies were moved into the mines. Because of this, the lives, stories, and history of these millions of everyday Parisians were almost completely lost. The only remaining remnants of these lives were records kept in the Tuileries Palace and the bones within the mines. While it didn't seem too detrimental at the time, this was only the beginning of what would become the erasure of the everyday historic Parisians' history. To honor the deceased, on April 7th, 1786, 3 abbots consecrated the mines, turning them into what is commonly known as the Paris catacombs. Now, during my research, I had the opportunity to talk with Jonas Sisson, a cartographer for the Ville de Paris administration's Highway Department for Quarry Control. He is highly educated and experienced with this subject and explained a lot of misinformation about it, including details around the aforementioned consecration. Notably, while these transformed resting places are commonly known as the Paris catacombs, a much more accurate name for it is the Paris ossuaries. Ossuaries, while similar in nature to catacombs, have one major difference. Catacombs have identified remains. Ossuaries do not. While Paris had found structural stability, the inner city economics were in an incredibly dire state. This was the driving force that threw the city of Paris into the infamous French Revolution. The wealth disparity during this time was incredibly great, with the wealthy Parisians were living a life of luxury, a life of which Paris's commercial industry has always thrived upon. However, these wealthy individuals were an overwhelming minority, and the vast majority of Parisians lived in deep poverty trying to make their way through the crowded streets. Paris has always had a unique structure due to the overwhelming lack of industries within the city walls. Instead, those opportunities being found outside the walls of the city in the greater Ile-de-France region. While there have been numerous benefits of this lack of an industrial presence within the city, such as the fact that the air pollution caused by such production would only further exacerbate Paris's health problems. This basically closed off huge opportunities for residents of lower economic classes to be able to make a good wage. Instead, the city focused the same crowded streets which exacerbated the spread of the bubonic plague several hundred years prior. Several years prior to the start of the revolution, the city had constructed one of the many walls which surrounded the city throughout its history. This wall, known as the Farmers' General Wall, was notable because it implemented a toll to get into or out of the city. Because of the wealth disparity within the city, this was not a popular decision. This, as well as overwhelming debt due to the French's assistance in the American Revolutionary War, and as well numerous crop failures, led to further socioeconomic issues within the city, which would eventually lead to the start of the revolution. While not intentional, the spatial structure of Paris at the time lent itself well to the revolutionaries. Because of the tight streets, they were able to build the famous barricades throughout the city, which greatly hindered the French military from reaching the revolutionaries. The French Revolution lasted for around a decade, establishing a parliament-elected directory in 1795, which ended up exacerbating financial issues and was riddled with corruption. The French public had a lot of resentment for the directory until November 9th, 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte threw a coup d'etat and ushered in the Napoleonic era. While there is endless amount of information we can divulge into regarding Napoleon Bonaparte, instead, we want to turn our attention to his nephew, Napoleon III. After the Napoleonic Wars and the exile of his uncle, this welcomed in the rise of the Second Republic of France, where he was named president. However, when he wasn't re-elected, he did what Frenchmen named Napoleon do best, and threw a coup, naming himself Emperor of France. Great. Napoleon III had a grand vision of what he wanted Paris to become, inspired by London, England, which compared to Paris at the time was considerably more modernized. With wider streets, a cohesive look, and a complex sewer system, he envisioned bringing these ideas into Paris. However, Napoleon III was no planner, and he needed someone who could see his ideas to fruition. This led to the hiring of one of history's most polarizing planning professionals, Prefect of the Seine, Baron George Haussmann. The transformation of Paris by Haussmann under the Second Empire completely transformed the structure of Paris. While previously all streets eventually connected to one prime area, being Ile-de-Cité, which was the original location of Lutetia by the Parisy people. However, since that time, Paris had grown exponentially and had an incredible amount of landmarks, which Haussmann envisioned a more streamlined connection to. Haussmann created numerous wide avenues throughout the city and connected Paris in a way never seen previously. His plans removed several medieval walls, including the aforementioned Farmers General Wall, and gave the city room to breathe. Because of the larger avenues, rather than the historically cramped streets, this helped considerably with the public health issues which had been plaguing the city for centuries. Also contributing to this was the incredibly complex sewer systems, which were built underneath the city and continues to operate to this day. While all of these changes did create a much healthier Paris than seen previously, it also had numerous issues it introduced as well. Another aspect of what Napoleon III and Haussmann envisioned for the city was a strict form-based code throughout the city's architecture. However, the historic buildings which had existed for centuries did not show this vision, and thus in order to follow this code and open up the city, Haussmann's plans ended up demolishing up to 20,000 buildings and displacing around 350,000 Parisians. Not only that, but these developments cost the city of Paris 2.5 billion franc bills, and with modern day inflation adds up to, only a mere 75 billion euros. Shockingly, because of Paris's sordid history with economic unrest, this was not popular. Now, he did build around 30,000 new buildings in Paris, but the historic remnants that had represented the inner city culture of Paris and its residents over the city's incredibly long life was now gone. This continued the city's track record of historic erasure due to its overwhelmingly top-down planning decisions. Haussmann and the Second Empire were incredibly unpopular, with such figures such as famous author of Les Miserables, Victor Hugo, making his disdain for the Haussmannization of Paris incredibly clear. There was also a huge political reasoning for the widening of the streets within the city. The French Empire was terrified of a similar situation as the French Revolution and wanted to streamline military access throughout the city and prevent barricades. The widening of the streets allowed for these desires to be seen through. Haussmann and his plans for Paris was, and continues to this day, to be incredibly polarizing, inspiring similarly unpopular top-down planners such as New York's Robert Moses, whose transformation of New York City is its own story in itself. However, in terms of Haussmann, while his plans were problematic, unpopular, and tone-deaf to many of the community needs throughout Paris, he also created the image of the city we all know now. When you are asked to envision what Paris is like, you likely see the ornate architecture and wide streets. Paris would not have as strong of an identity as it does now without Haussmann's transformation. It is because of these changes that the city is commonly referred to as the City of Light, due to its wide streets, which allowed considerable sunlight throughout the city. Overall, Haussmann's transformation of the city provided an immense amount of benefits towards the city. However, it also only further exacerbated the city's problems with planning decisions, and it only further divided the relationship between the spatial structure of Paris from the people who lived within it. As time went on, this division only became clearer. This culminated with the year 1871, when the French National Guard, which had been protecting Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, had overthrown the city due to rising resentment towards the empire and rising socialist views. This established the Paris Commune, which, granted, only lasted 2 months. But the impact that it had on the city was severe, particularly because of what is now known as the Bloody Week, and especially because of an event on May 23rd, 1871. The now Third Republic, Versailles, the active ruling empire of France, had overtaken most of Paris, of which the opposing party, known as the Communards, had previously occupied. The Third Republic had taken to killing hundreds of people suspected to be Communards, and in response, the Communards took to burning many historic government buildings throughout the city. One of these were the Tuileries Palace, This is of particular note due to the previous mention that the records of the individuals buried in the Parisian ossuaries were stored inside the palace. These records were lost in this fire and thus practically cemented the erasure of these lives from history, which spans several centuries. Because of continuous top-down decision-making and political unrest, the individuals which literally hold up this city practically no longer existed in the city's records. Now, this has been attempted to be rectified by a modern-day project to recover medieval birth records, wedding certificates, death certificates, and similar papers found primarily throughout historic chapels. But the burning of these papers greatly altered the historic preservation efforts of the city and damned the remains beneath the city to an eternity of ambiguity. These remains and their lost stories will continue to be a symbolic representation of the damage caused by such top-down planning decisions. Paris continues to this day to be one of the most highly influential cities in all of history. Its impact on the ancient, medieval, and modern world cannot be understated, and is one of the most unique urban structures ever seen. However, Paris at its core is a city of duality. While Paris is an undeniably beautiful and historic city on its surface, which has earned the right to its naming as the City of Light, it also has a staunch undertow of continual political and economic division, with immense gaps in local historical remains. The complex system beneath the city has been commonly labeled as the City of Darkness and shows this balance that the city holds to this very day. There's a clear reason why the Paris syndrome has been medically recognized from psychological reactions from individuals who have seen this faraway, romanticized, and perfect vision of the city, and then gone there to see a realistic and very much flawed version of it. Modern Paris has taken immense steps into revitalizing the city and ushering in a new people-centric and climate-resilient city. One such example is the vast transformation of the city's auto-based infrastructure, which has previously dominated the city, as well as numerous historical landmarks. One of these, and the most obvious example, is the Arc de Triomphe, as well as the Champs-Élysées, which previously have been focused on allowing car traffic through instead of people. Particularly, the roundabout surrounding the Arc has been polarizing and diverted tourists from the historic landmark. However, the city has introduced a massive plan to transform the space into a pedestrian and bike-focused space, and is minimizing auto infrastructure throughout the entire city and encouraging people to utilize the incredibly complex public transportation network. This network webs the city together and connects it in a way which people like Haussmann could only dream of achieving. Paris has also been working incredibly hard to clean up the Seine River, which is infamously polluted, and preparing the city for a potential flooding of the river due to fears of a massive flood similar in size to one which overtook the city in 1910. Especially with the city's prominence in modern-day political changes such as the Paris Climate Agreement from 2016, the city hopes to utilize its unique global position to usher in urban trends which push the world into a more climate-friendly and people-focused future. However, in order to do this, the city needs to finally incorporate a more bottom-up focus which addresses the numerous needs which have forced several public sectors in the last few years to go on strike and upend the city's basic functionalities. In order to take Paris into this desired new age that is people-focused, the city's planning history and issues of historical erasure need to be recognized and rectified. It is up to the city and its decision-making to take those steps and really show that Paris is truly a place for the people, not the plans. So, if I can ask again, what do you see when you think of Paris, France?